The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 9. Who could have foreseen it? A dreadful thing has happened to us. Who could have foreseen it? I cannot foresee any end to our troubles. It may be that we are condemned to spend our whole lives in this strange, inaccessible place. I am still so confused that I can hardly think clearly of the facts of the present or of the chances of the future. To my astounded senses, the one seems most terrible, and the other as black as night. If we are to win through, it is only our own qualities which can save us. I have as companions 3 remarkable men, of great brain power and of unshaken courage. There lies our one and only hope. It is only when I look upon the untroubled faces of my comrades that I see some glimmer through the darkness. When I finished my last letter, I stated that we were within 7 miles of an enormous line of ruddy cliffs, which encircled beyond all doubt the plateau of which Professor Challenger spoke. Their height, as we approached them, seemed to me in some places to be greater than he had stated, running up in parts to at least 1,000 feet. The summit showed every sign of a luxuriant vegetation, with bushes near the edge, and farther back many high trees. But there was no indication of any life that we could see. The crags above us were not merely perpendicular, but curved outwards at the top, so that ascent was out of the question. Close to us was the high, thin pinnacle of rock which I believe I mentioned earlier in this narrative. It is like a broad red church spire, the top of it being level with the plateau, but a great chasm gaping between them. On the summit of it there grew one high tree. Both pinnacle and cliff were comparatively low, some 500 or 600 feet, I should think. "It was on that," said Professor Challenger, pointing to this tree, "that the pterodactyl perched. I climbed halfway up the rock before I shot him. I am inclined to think that a good mountaineer like myself could ascend that rock to the top, though he would, of course, be no nearer to the plateau when he had done so." As Challenger spoke of his pterodactyl, I glanced at Professor Summerlee, and for the first time I seemed to see some signs of a dawning credulity and repentance. There was no sneer upon his lips, but on the contrary a grey, drawn look of excitement and amazement. Challenger saw it too, and revelled in the first taste of victory. "Of course," said he, with his clumsy and ponderous sarcasm, "Professor Summerlee will understand that when I speak of a pterodactyl, I mean a stork. Only it is the kind of stork which has no feathers, a leathery skin, membranous wings, and teeth in its jaws." He grinned and blinked, and bowed until his colleague turned and walked away. In the morning we held a council of war as to the best method of ascending the plateau above us. Challenger presided with a solemnity as if he were the Lord Chief Justice on the bench. Picture him seated upon a rock, his absurd boyish straw hat tilted on the back of his head, his supercilious eyes dominating us from under his drooping lids, his great black beard wagging as he slowly defined our present situation and our future movements. Beneath him you might have seen the 3 of us, myself, sunburnt, young and vigorous after our open-air tramp, Summerlee, solemn but still critical, behind his eternal pipe, Lord John, as keen as a razor edge, with his supple, alert figure leaning upon his rifle, and his eager eyes fixed eagerly upon the speaker. Behind us were grouped the rest of our expedition, while in front and above us towered those huge ruddy ribs of rock which kept us from our goal. "I need not say," said our leader, "that on the occasion of my last visit I exhausted every means of climbing the cliff, and where I failed I do not think that anyone else is likely to succeed, for I am something of a mountaineer. I had none of the appliances of a rock climber with me, but I have taken the precaution to bring them now. With their aid I am positive I could climb that detached pinnacle to the summit, but so long as the main cliff overhangs it is vain to attempt ascending that. I was hurried upon my last visit by the approach of the rainy season, and I can only claim that I have surveyed about 6 miles of the cliff to the east of us, finding no possible way up. What then shall we do?" "There seems to be only one reasonable course," said Professor Summerlee. "If you have explored the east, we should travel along the base of the cliff to the west, and seek for a practicable point for our ascent." "That's it," said Lord John. "The odds are that this plateau is of no great size, and we shall travel round it until we either find an easy way up it, or come back to the point from which we started." "I have already explained to our young friend here," said Challenger, he has a way of alluding to me as if I were a schoolchild 10 years old, "that it is quite impossible that there should be any easy way up anywhere, for the simple reason that if there were, the summit would not be isolated, and those conditions would not obtain which have effected so singular an interference with the general laws of survival. Yet I admit that there may very well be places where an expert human climber may reach the summit, and yet a cumbrous, heavy animal be unable to descend. It is certain that there is a point where the ascent is possible." "How do you know that, sir?" asked Summerlee sharply. "Because my predecessor, the American, Maple White, actually made such an ascent. How otherwise could he have seen the monster which he sketched in his notebook?" "There you reason somewhat ahead of the proved facts," said the stubborn Summerlee. "I admit your plateau because I have seen it, but I have not as yet satisfied myself that it contains any form of life whatever." "What you admit, sir, or what you do not admit, is really of inconceivably small importance. I am glad to perceive that the plateau itself has actually obtruded itself upon your intelligence." He glanced up at it, and then to our amazement he sprang from his rock and seized Summerlee by the neck. He tilted his face into the air. "Now, sir," he shouted, hoarse with excitement, "do I help you to realize that the plateau contains some animal life?" I have said that a thick fringe of green overhung the edge of the cliff. Out of this there had emerged a black, glistening object. As it came slowly forth and overhung the chasm, we saw that it was a very large snake, with a peculiar flat, spade-like head. It wavered and quivered above us for a minute, the morning sun glinting upon its sleek, sinuous coils. Then it slowly drew inwards and disappeared. Summerlee had been so interested that he had stood unresisting while Challenger tilted his head into the air. Now he shook his colleague off and came back to his dignity. "I should be glad, Professor Challenger," said he, "if you could see your way to make any remarks which may occur to you without seizing me by the chin. Even the appearance of a very ordinary rock python does not appear to justify such a liberty." "But there is life upon the plateau all the same," his colleague replied in triumph. "And now, having demonstrated this important conclusion so that it is clear to anyone, however prejudiced or obtuse, I am of opinion that we cannot do better than break up our camp and travel to westward until we find some means of ascent." The ground at the foot of the cliff was rocky and broken, so that the going was slow and difficult. Suddenly we came, however, upon something which cheered our hearts. It was the site of an old encampment. "Not mine," said Challenger. "It must be Maple White's." Lord John had been gazing curiously at a great tree fern which overshadowed the encampment. "I say, look at this," said he. "I believe it is meant for a signpost." A slip of hard wood had been nailed to the tree in such a way as to point to the westward. "Most certainly a signpost," said Challenger. "What else? Finding himself upon a dangerous errand, our pioneer has left this sign so that any party which follows him may know the way he has taken. Perhaps we shall come upon some other indications as we proceed." We did indeed, but they were of a terrible and most unexpected nature. Immediately beneath the cliff there grew a considerable patch of high bamboo like that which we had traversed in our journey. We were passing along the edge of this cover when my eye was caught by the gleam of something white within it. Thrusting my head between the stems, I found myself gazing at a fleshless skull. The whole skeleton was there, but the skull had detached itself and lay some feet nearer to the open. With a few blows from the machetes of our Indians, we cleared the spot and were able to study the details of this old tragedy. Only a few shreds of clothes could still be distinguished, but there were the remains of boots upon the bony feet, and it was very clear that the dead man was a European. A gold watch by Hudson of New York, and a chain which held a stylographic pen lay among the bones. There was a silver cigarette case with J.C. from AES upon the lid. The state of the metal seemed to show that the catastrophe had occurred no great time before. "Who can he be?" asked Lord John. "Poor devil! Every bone in his body seems to be broken." "And the bamboo grows through his smashed ribs," said Summerlee. "It is a fast-growing plant, but it is surely inconceivable that his body could have been here while the canes grew to be 20 feet in length." "As to the man's identity," said Professor Challenger, "I have no doubt whatever upon that point. As I made my way upriver before I reached you at Manaos, I instituted very particular inquiries about Maple White. It transpires he was not alone on his travels. There was a friend who accompanied him, an American named James Culver. I think, therefore, that there can be no doubt that we are now looking upon the remains of this James Culver." "Nor," said Lord John, "is there much doubt as to how he met his death. He has fallen or been chucked from the top, and so has been impaled. How else could he have come by his broken bones, and how could he have been struck through by these canes with their point so high above our heads?" A hush came over us as we stood round these shattered remains and realized the truth of Lord Roxton's words. The beetling head of the cliff projected over the canebrake. Undoubtedly he had fallen from above. But had he fallen? Had it been an accident? Or, already ominous and terrible possibilities began to round the unknown land. We moved off in silence, and continued to coast round the line of cliffs. In 5 miles we saw no rift or break, and then suddenly we perceived something which filled us with new hope. In a hollow of the rock, protected from the rain, there was drawn a rough arrow in chalk, pointing still to the westwards. We had proceeded some 5 miles more, when again we saw a white arrow upon the rocks. It was at a point where the face of the cliff was for the first time split into a narrow cleft. Inside the cleft was a second guidance mark, which pointed right up it with the tip somewhat elevated, as if the spot indicated were above the level of the ground. The narrow gorge was not more than 40 feet across at the mouth, but it rapidly closed until it ended in an acute angle, too straight and smooth for an ascent. And then suddenly the quick eyes of Lord John fell upon what we were seeking. High above our heads, amid the dark shadows, there was one circle of deeper gloom, the opening of a cave. The base of the cliff was heaped with loose stones at that spot, and it was not difficult to clamber up. When we reached it, all doubt was removed. Not only was it an opening into the rock, but on the side of it there was marked once again the sign of the arrow. Here was the point, and this the means by which Maplewhite and his ill-fated comrade had made their ascent. The cave had evidently been water-worn, the sides being smooth and the floor covered with rounded stones. It was of such a size that a single man could just fit through by stooping. For 50 yards it ran almost straight into the rock, and then it ascended at an angle of 45. Presently this incline became even steeper, and we found ourselves climbing upon hands and knees among loose rubble which slid from beneath us. Suddenly an exclamation broke from Lord Roxton. "It's blocked," said he. "The roof has fallen in." In vain we dragged out some of the pieces, but it was soon evident that the obstacle was far beyond any efforts which we could make to remove it. The road by which Maplewhite had ascended was no longer available. Too much cast down to speak, we stumbled down and out of the dark tunnel. That night, I am still speaking of the first day of our circumnavigation of the plateau, a great experience awaited us, and one which for ever set at rest any doubt which we could have as to the wonders so near us. What occurred was this. Lord John had shot a small pig-like creature, and half of it having been given to the Indians, we were cooking the other half upon our fire. There was a chill in the air after dark, and we had all drawn close to the blaze. The night was moonless, but there were some stars, and one could see for a little distance across the plain. Well, suddenly, out of the darkness, out of the night, there swooped something with a swish like an aeroplane. The whole group of us were covered for an instant by a canopy of leathery wings, and I had a momentary vision of a long snake-like neck, a fierce red greedy eye, and a great snapping beak, filled to my amazement with little gleaming teeth. The next instant it was gone, and so was our dinner. A huge black shadow 20 feet across skimmed up into the air. For an instant the monster wings blotted out the stars, and then it vanished over the brow of the cliff above us. We all sat in amazed silence round the fire, like the heroes of Virgil when the harpies came down upon them. It was Summerlee who was the first to speak. "Professor Challenger," said he, in a solemn voice, which quavered with emotion, "I owe you an apology. Sir, I am very much in the wrong, and I beg that you will forget what is past." It was handsomely said, and the two men for the first time shook hands. So much we have gained by this clear vision of our first pterodactyl. It was worth a stolen supper to bring two such men together. As our circumnavigation continued, the cliffs lost their ruddy tint, becoming chocolate-brown in colour. The vegetation became more scattered along the top of them, and they sank to 300 or 400 feet in height. But in no place did we find any point where they could be ascended. If anything, they were more impossible than at the first point where we had met them. "Surely," said I, as we discussed the situation, "the rain must find its way down somehow. There are bound to be water channels in the rocks." "Our young friend has glimpses of lucidity," said Professor Challenger. "The only drawback is that we have conclusively proved by ocular demonstration that there are no water channels down the rocks." "Where then does it go?" I persisted. "I think it may be fairly assumed that if it does not come outwards, then it must run inwards." "Then there is a lake in the centre." "So I should suppose." On the 6th day we completed our first circuit of the cliffs, and found ourselves back at the first camp beside the isolated pinnacle of rock. We were a disconsolate party, for nothing could have been more minute than our investigation, and it was absolutely certain that there was no single point where the most active human being could possibly hope to scale the cliff. The place which Maplewhite's chalk marks had indicated as his own means of access was now entirely impassable. No wonder that we looked gloomily at each other that night, and sought our blankets with hardly a word exchanged. I remember that as I dropped off to sleep, my last recollection was that Challenger was squatting like a monstrous bullfrog by the fire, his huge head in his hands, sunk apparently in the deepest thought, and entirely oblivious to the good night which I wished him. But it was a very different Challenger who greeted us in the morning, a Challenger with contentment and self-congratulation shining from his whole person. "Gentlemen," he declared, "the problem is solved. You have found a way up?" "I venture to think so." "And where?" For answer he pointed to the spire-like pinnacle upon our right. Our faces, or mine at least, fell as we surveyed it. That it could be climbed we had our companion's assurance, but a horrible abyss lay between it and the plateau. "We can never get across," I gasped. "We can at least all reach the summit," said he. "When we are up, I may be able to show you that the resources of an inventive mind are not yet exhausted." After breakfast we unpacked the bundle in which our leader had brought his climbing accessories. From it he took a coil of the strongest and lightest rope, 150 feet in length, with climbing irons, clamps, and other devices. Lord John was an experienced mountaineer, and Summerlee had done some rough climbing at various times, so that I was really the novice at rock work of the party, but my strength and activity may have made up for my want of experience. It was not in reality a very stiff task, but I could not have accomplished it, nor could Summerlee if Challenger had not gained the summit. It was extraordinary to see such activity in so unwieldy a creature, and there fixed the rope round the trunk of the considerable tree which grew there. With this as our support, we were soon able to scramble up the jagged wall until we found ourselves upon the small grassy platform, some 25 feet each way, which formed the summit. The first impression which I received when I had recovered my breath was of the extraordinary view over the country which we had traversed. The whole Brazilian plain seemed to lie beneath us, extending away and away until it ended in dim blue mists upon the farthest skyline. I was drinking in this wonderful panorama when the heavy hand of the professor fell upon my shoulder. "This way, my young friend," said he. "Vestigia nulla retrosum." Never look rearwards, but always to our glorious goal. The level of the plateau, when I turned, was exactly that on which we stood, and the green bank of bushes, with occasional trees, was so near that it was difficult to realize how inaccessible it remained. At a rough guess, the gulf was 40 feet across, but as far as I could see it might as well have been 40 miles. I placed one arm round the trunk of the tree and leaned over the abyss. Far down were the small dark figures of our servants, looking up at us. The wall was absolutely precipitous, as was that which faced me. "This is indeed curious," said the creaking voice of Professor Summerlee. I turned and found that he was examining with great interest the tree to which I clung. That smooth bark and those small ribbed leaves seemed familiar to my eyes. "Why," I cried, "it's a beech!" "Exactly," said Summerlee. "A fellow countryman in a far land." "Not only a fellow countryman, my good sir," said Challenger, "but also, if I may be allowed to enlarge your simile, an ally of the first value. This beech tree will be our saviour." "By George!" cried Lord John. "A bridge!" "Exactly, my friends, a bridge. Last night you will admit that all our backs were to the wall, but where willpower and intellect go together, there is always a way out. A drawbridge had to be found which could be dropped across the abyss. Behold it." It was certainly a brilliant idea. The tree was a good 60 feet in height, and if it only fell the right way, it would easily cross the chasm. Challenger had slung the camp axe over his shoulder when he ascended. Now he handed it to me. "Our young friend has the thews and sinew," said he. I think he will be the most useful at this task. I must beg, however, that you will kindly refrain from thinking for yourself, and that you will do exactly what you are told." Under his direction, I cut such gashes in the side of the tree as would ensure that it should fall as we desired. It had already a strong natural tilt in the direction of the plateau, so the matter was not difficult. Finally, I set to work in earnest upon the trunk, taking turn and turn with Lord John. In a little over an hour there was a loud crack, and the tree swayed forward and then crashed over, burying the branches among the bushes on the farther side. The severed trunk rolled to the very edge of our platform, and for one terrible second we all thought it was over. It balanced itself, however, a few inches from the edge, and there was our bridge to the unknown. All of us, without a word, shook hands with Professor Challenger, who raised his straw hat and bowed deeply in each turn. "I claim the honour," said he, "to be the first to cross to the unknown land, a fitting subject, no doubt, for some future historical painting." He had approached the bridge when Lord John laid his hand upon his coat. "My dear chap," said he, "I really cannot allow it." "Cannot allow it, sir?" The head went back and the beard forward. "When it is a matter of science, don't you know, I follow your lead because you are by way of being a man of science. It's up to you to follow me when you come into my department." "Your department, sir?" "We all have our professions, and soldier is mine. We are, according to my ideas, invading a new country, which may or may not be chock full of enemies of sorts. To barge blindly into it for want of a little common sense and patience isn't my notion of management." The remonstration was too reasonable to be disregarded. Challenger tossed his head and shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Well, sir, what do you propose?" "For all I know, there may be a tribe of cannibals waiting for lunchtime among those very bushes," said Lord John, looking across the bridge. "It's better to learn wisdom before you go into a cooking pot. So we will content ourselves with hoping there is no trouble waiting for us, and at the same time we will act as if there were. Malone and I will go down, therefore, and we will fetch up 4 rifles, together with Gomez and his compatriot. One man can then go across, and the rest will cover him with guns until he sees that it is safe for the whole crowd to come along." Within an hour we had brought up the rifles and a shotgun. Gomez and his compatriot had ascended also, and under Lord John's orders they had carried up a bale of provisions in case our first exploration should be a long one. We had each bandoliers of cartridges. "Now, Challenger, if you really insist on being the first man in," said Lord John, when every preparation was complete. "I am much indebted to you for your gracious permission," said the angry professor, for never was a man so intolerant of every form of authority. "Since you are good enough to allow it, I shall most certainly take it upon myself to act as pioneer upon this occasion." Seated with a leg overhanging the abyss on each side, and his hatchet slung upon his back, Challenger hopped his way across the trunk and was soon at the other side. He clambered up and waved his arms in the air. "At last!" he cried. "At last!" I gazed anxiously at him with a vague expectation that some terrible fate would dart at him from the curtain of green behind him. But all was quiet. Summerlee was the second. His wiry energy is wonderful in so frail a frame. He insisted upon having 2 rifles slung upon his back, so that both professors were armed when he made his transit. I came next and tried hard not to look down into the horrible gulf over which I was passing. Summerlee held out the butt end of his rifle, and an instant later I was able to grasp his hand. As to Lord John, he walked across, actually walked, without support. He must have nerves of iron. And there we were, the 4 of us upon the dreamland, the lost world of Maple White. To all of us it seemed the moment of our supreme triumph. Who could have guessed that it was the prelude to our supreme disaster? Let me say in a few words how the crushing blow fell upon us. We had turned away from the edge, and had penetrated about 50 yards of close brushwood, when there came a frightful rending crash from behind us. With one impulse we rushed back the way we had come. The bridge was gone. Far down at the base of the cliff I saw, as I looked over, a tangled mass of branches and splintered trunk. Had the edge of the platform crumbled and let it through? For a moment this explanation was in all our minds. The next, from the farther side of the rocky pinnacle before us, a swarthy face, the face of Gomez, was slowly protruded. Yes, it was Gomez, but no longer the Gomez of the demure smile and the mask-like expression. Here was a face with flashing eyes and distorted features, a face convulsed with hatred and with the mad joy of gratified revenge. "Lord Roxton!" he shouted. "Lord John Roxton!" "Well," said our companion, "here I am." A shriek of laughter came across the abyss. "Yes, there you are, you English dog, and there you will remain. I have waited, and now has come my chance. You found it hard to get up. You will find it harder to get down, you cursed fools. You are trapped, every one of you." We were too astonished to speak. We could only stand there, staring in amazement. A great broken bough upon the grass showed where he had gained his leverage to tilt over our bridge. "You are dead men," he cried. "Your bones will whiten up there, and none will know where you lie or come to cover them. As you lie dying, think of Lopez, whom you shot 5 years ago on the Putumayo River. I am his brother, and come what will, I will die happy now, for his memory has been avenged." Had the man simply wrought his revenge and then escaped, all might have been well with him. It was that foolish, irresistible Latin impulse to be dramatic which brought his own downfall. Roxton, the man who had earned himself the name of the flail of the Lord through 3 countries, was not one who could be safely taunted. Gomez was descending on the far side of the pinnacle, but before he could reach the ground, Lord John had run along the edge of the plateau and gained a point from which he could see his man. There was a single crack of his rifle, and though we saw nothing, we heard the scream, and then the distant thud of the falling body. Roxton came back to us with a face of granite. "I have been a blind simpleton," said he bitterly. "It's my folly that has brought you all into this trouble. I should have remembered that these people have long memories for blood feuds, and been more upon my guard." "What about the other one? It took 2 of them to lever that tree over the edge. I could have shot him, but I let him go. He may have had no part in it. Perhaps it would have been better if I had killed him, for he must, as you say, have lent a hand." We were still discussing it, endeavouring to adjust our minds to these new conditions, when a singular scene in the plain below arrested our attention. A man in white clothes, who could only have been Gomez's accomplice, was running as one does run when death is the pacemaker. Behind him, only a few yards in his rear, bounded the huge ebony figure of Zambo, our devoted Hercules. Even as we looked, he sprang upon the back of the fugitive and flung his arms round his neck. They rolled on the ground together. An instant afterwards, Zambo rose, looked at the prostrate man, and then, waving his hand joyously to us, came running in our direction. The white figure lay motionless in the middle of the great plain. Our 2 traitors had been destroyed, but the mischief which they had done lived after them. By no possible means could we get back to the pinnacle. No human ingenuity could suggest a means of bridging the chasm which yawned before us. One instant had altered the whole condition of our existence. It was at such a moment that I learned the stuff of which my 3 comrades were composed. They were grave, it is true, and thoughtful, but of an invincible serenity. For the moment we could only sit among the bushes in patience and wait the coming of Zambo. Presently his honest dark face topped the rocks, and his Herculean figure emerged upon the top of the pinnacle. "What I do now?" he cried. "You tell me, and I do it." It was a question which it was easier to ask than to answer. One thing only was clear. He was our one trusty link with the outside world. On no account must he leave us. "No, no," he cried. "I not leave you. Whatever come, you always find me here. But not able to keep Indians. Already they say too much Kurupuri live in this place, and they go home. Now you leave them, me no able to keep them." "Make them wait till tomorrow, Zambo," I shouted. "Then I can send letter back by them." "Very good, sir. I promise they wait till tomorrow," said the giant. "But what I do for you now?" There was plenty for him to do, and admirably the faithful fellow did it. First of all, under our directions, he undid the rope from the tree stump and threw one end of it across to us. It was not thicker than a clothesline, but it was of greater strength, and though we could not make a bridge of it, we might well find it invaluable if we had any climbing to do. He then fastened his end of the rope to the package of supplies which had been carried up, and we were able to drag it across. This gave us the means of life for at least a week, even if we found nothing else. Finally he descended and carried up more supplies, all of which we got across by throwing our rope to him and hauling it back. It was evening when he had last climbed down, with a final assurance that he would keep the Indians till next morning. And so it is that I have spent nearly the whole of this our first night upon the plateau writing up our experiences by the light of a single candle lantern. Tomorrow, or today rather, for it is already dawn as I write, we shall make our first venture into this strange land. When I shall be able to write again, or if I ever shall write again, I know not. Meanwhile, I can see that the Indians are still in their place, and I am sure that the faithful Zambo will be here presently to get my letter. I only trust that it will come to your hand.